In Australia, we don't have the right to bear arms in our constitution, and ever since the 1996 gun ban by John Howard, we think of ourselves as a disarmed nation. Now, of course, that's not true. There are many hunters and sporting shooters that do enjoy the use of firearms for a range of different reasons, but self-defense isn't one of them. But there are people who would like to change that. My name's Topher. This is the Topher Project, and I help to keep people like you, busy people, up to date with the world as it changes around us. And some of the people that like to change the world, and in fact that's their job, are the people that write legislation here in Australia, either at a state or a federal level. Lots of terrible legislation gets passed every year, but every now and again we find a politician who is willing to put their hat in the ring and try and argue for something good. And one such person is the New South Wales MP, John Ruddick, and he joins me now. Welcome to the Topher Project. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good to see you, Topher.
Now, for those who aren't in politics and don't sort of live in this world, that may not understand that time on the floor of Parliament, on the floor of the chamber, being able to speak is relatively precious. So the things that you choose to make a priority are relatively carefully selected. Tell me a little bit about your decision recently to really have a red hot go and in fact introducing legislation to make some amendments to the Constitution, etc. in the United States. Here we go. That's for later in the conversation. In New South Wales, regarding the right to bear arms and to be able to defend yourself using weapons. Your decisions around that are interesting to me. Can you explain why that was such a priority for you?
I believe it's important, Topher, for the people to have the right to access a firearm if they choose to. They don't have to have one, but I believe it's important for the people to be armed as a counterweight to the state, because all the people that say they don't want guns, They don't say they don't want anyone to have guns. They want the government to have all the guns. That's what they're saying. Now, libertarians like yourself, we're pretty good at history, generally speaking, more than most people. And we know that governments, unchecked, will, over time, slowly but surely, morph into a tyranny. So what we're saying is, now, how can we keep this heavily armed state in their box? How can we keep government limited? Well, if the people have got the right to own firearms, it's a counterweight to the state. And what that means is, in the worst of circumstances, if the government does become a tyranny, we've got the power to overthrow them. Now, in COVID, you had one or two things to do with COVID. It was very similar, the COVID psyop in the United States, as it was in Australia. The political leaders were telling us all to take the vax. The corporate media was crazy about it. The courts, the academics, the bureaucrats, everybody, the cops. It was the same in Australia as it was in America. However, in Australia, 98% of people took 2 of the warp speed vaccines, and in America, it's about 75%. What's the difference? What's the difference? It's because the American government knows that they can't push the American people around that much, or there'll be trouble. In Australia, they can treat us like farm animals because we're unarmed, and they did treat us like farm animals.
I'm sorry to interrupt my interview with John Ruddick, MLC. I hope you're enjoying that and the fact that there are people out there advocating for your right to keep and bear arms. My name is Topher. This is the Topher Project, and I am 100% viewer supported. So I rely on you guys to keep me funded and to keep me going. So if this kind of coverage here in Australia is what you would like to see more of, then please head over to topherfield.net, where you can buy me a coffee, help to keep me caffeinated and angry, because that's how I do my best work. And also, if you haven't yet bought my best-selling books, The Good People Break Bad Laws, my first best-selling book, All Good Christians Break Bad Laws, my second best-selling book, or my multi-award-winning DVD, Battleground Melbourne, or indeed my merch, including this one, Too Much 1984, Not Enough 1776. It's one of my personal favourites. Then you can find all of that at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com, and you'll be helping to keep me in business, doing what I do, bringing you stories and interviews like this one. So without further ado, let's get back to John Ruddick, MLC. Well, you'll get no argument from me on that particular point. My viewers tend to know my background regarding COVID very, very well. But what I'm hearing you say is that maybe we've got too much 1984 and not enough 1776. You're actually going so much further than just a self-defense, home defense, being able to protect your business, protect your car. You're actually putting this in the context of potentially the need for a future, hypothetical, of course, at this point, insurrection, the need for the people to actually stand up against their own government.
Well, the thing is, there will not be an insurrection. There will not be a rebellion if the people have got the guns in the first place. Okay, that's the very important point. There's been 2 magnificent generations in human history. The first was the ancient Greeks, in the 3rd and 4th century BC. The second one was the American founding fathers. I'm talking constitutionally. Jesus and St. Paul were also good guys, but politically, constitution. Now, the American founding fathers were living under a tyranny from Britain, Britain was on the other side of the Atlantic, and the American people had become very accustomed to freedom. Now, then the British were imposing taxes and everything else and doing other bad things. Then the Americans rebelled, overthrew them. They set up their own republic. Now, then they said, well, look, we don't want to go back to where we were. We might now have our own government, but because the American founding fathers were very, very into their Roman history, and they saw how a republic can become a dictatorship. And so the Americans said, look, to prevent this happening in the first place, well, first up, when they had their Bill of Rights, they said the most important right that we want the Constitution to protect is the right to free speech and free religion. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course.
But the Second Amendment was the right to bear arms. And most people in Australia think, oh, why do they think that's so important? Why do they think that?
Yeah.
That's what I spent much of my life thinking the same thing. Well, what we know is that you can't have the First Amendment protected without the Second Amendment security in the background.
To say that this is a minority position in Australia is an incredible understatement. Of course, I agree with your position on this, and I'm grateful that you advocated for it in Parliament. But we don't have majority support from the Australian public on this. And given that time on the floor of Parliament is precious, what made this such a priority that this is something you're going to fight for? Even though realistically, I mean, what do you think your chances are of actually changing any legislation in the near future?
Well, look, every great journey starts with the first step. This is a first step. Okay, now you are right. It's not a majority opinion in Australia. I believe pre-COVID, I'm guessing, but I reckon 3% of Australians would have agreed with you and I on the right to bear arms. I believe post-COVID, and I believe now with the advent of street crime escalating in this country, I believe it's now 10%. Now, no one's doing polling on it. I might be wrong. Might be more. I think it's growing. When I kicked this off, I knew it would be controversial, and I expected to get a lot of attack from the left. Well, the left has been, pretty quiet on it, and I have been very encouraged by how much support there is, and a lot of people saying, "Look, I didn't used to support this. Now I do."
Yeah. Well, you and I were just chatting before we began recording. Each of us has had our own evolution on this. I supported John Howard's gun ban when he brought that in 1996. That's a position that I completely disagree with now. And I'm very much a libertarian when it comes to guns, when it comes to self-defense. But you mentioned street crime. Victoria has just banned machetes. We are seeing, of course, a continuation of street crime, including street crime involving machetes since that ban. But in terms of legislatively, Victoria has moved very strongly away from your position. A lot of Victorians do support the Jacinta Allen government in that particular position. How do you see having more guns and more weapons in the community as being relevant or even a good thing to street crime?
Okay, well, look, when people when people who are opposed to guns, they bring up, what about the United States? Okay, well, I say, well, what about Switzerland? What about Switzerland? Okay, Switzerland's got a very similar level of gun ownership, and it's got the lowest homicide rate in the world, except for tiny little countries like Monaco and Luxembourg and probably Switzerland. Singapore. But out of reasonable sized countries, Switzerland's got the lowest homicide rate in the world, but pretty much every home has got a gun. So the guns aren't the problem. Now, there are 50 states in America, and about a dozen of them have a lower homicide rate than New South Wales. New Hampshire on planet Earth today is the most pro-gun rights jurisdiction in the world. Okay, people, you can go shopping at your 7-Eleven, have a gun in your pocket, and you don't have to tell anyone about it. Okay.
Yeah.
They had 11 murders last year for every million people. New South Wales had 33. So we've got three times as many murders.
Wow.
And there's a dozen states in America with a lower homicide rate than New South Wales. There's about another dozen or so states with a similar homicide rate to New South Wales. Now, we're not going to beat around the bush. Yes, in New York and Illinois, California and Chicago, high crime rate, high homicide rate, and guns are involved. Now, what's the problem there? Since we know it's not the guns causing it, we look at Switzerland and New Hampshire and Wyoming and others. It's the inner city crime gangs, okay? That's a separate issue. That's not good, okay? But that is a separate issue. It's the same with the machetes. The machete hasn't killed anybody, okay? people using the machete. So firstly, we've got to be more careful about our immigration program. And look, when I look at all this debt that poor old Victoria's racked up thanks to Dan Andrews, okay, and when the economy is going bad, there's just a general increase in crime. So it's the bad immigration, it's the very poor economy. Welfare. When you give people free money, they're more likely to be sitting around being bored and getting up to bad things.
No, unfortunately, it is. You're not wrong, and there is a lot more to it than just what weapons are available. And we see banning guns is one thing, but other weapons can be used, can be improvised, and we're seeing that people who are committing violent crimes are not being held accountable to the existing laws. And so, gun bans or weapon bans, obviously, they're not going to obey those sorts of laws either. In terms of looking forward and going forward, how would you imagine something like this working? You've put forward some legislation that is bespoke to the New South Wales legislative system and situation. Can we take a step back from that for a moment? Let's say the public will were there, or there were enough people on the fence that with the right framework in place, they might be able to be persuaded to support this. What are you actually advocating for in practical legislative terms?
Well, unashamedly, the US Second Amendment. We want it embedded in our Constitution. Now, the New South Wales Parliament does have a constitution, but it's a Clayton's constitution. It's just a piece of legislation. A real constitution is separate to the politicians, and that's why we have referendums to change the constitution. And in the United States, it's even harder than a referendum. Okay, but the New South Wales Constitution, it's technically a constitution, but it's just an act. You don't even need like a super majority to change the constitution. Just need 51%. That's right. So look, it was an opportunity to get the debate happening. Now, if the bill gets approved, which I don't think it will, but we're going to do our best, then it would then be in the New South Wales Constitution, okay, that we have the right to bear arms. Okay, now that doesn't matter that much, okay, even if we've got that through. What we really need is we need this embedded in the Australian Commonwealth Constitution, and we need to do that via a referendum. Is that going to happen tomorrow? No, but we have to absolutely keep the pressure up until we do have it. Look, it's not all the other things we said about stopping tyranny and crime is an important deal. There's another very good reason why we need to have the right to bear arms at Topher, and that is an invasion. Okay, now let's say America, which is the world's most powerful economy, etc., etc. Let's say it had not a 5-year Great Depression, a 50-year Great Depression, and let's say at the same time China and Russia their economy became 5 times bigger than the United States. Okay, so I don't think it's going to happen, but let's imagine it did happen. Even under those circumstances, with a much weakened America, no one's going to invade America, are they? Because every second house is going to have a pretty seriously powered gun, right? Now, in Australia, my position is that we should be the Switzerland of the South Pacific, where we should be not involved in meddling in foreign conflict, okay? Now, but we can't do that at the moment. We can't do that because if we got out of the American security umbrella, well, then, a foreign aggressor could say, well, we'll take out the Australian Defence Force. Now, Australia's got an impressive military, but it's relatively small. And we've got a big continent,
Big land mass.
Big land mass, a lot of wealth, a lot of buildings, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of people. And so if they took out the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and then they wanted to invade us, well, they're going to be reluctant to do it if they think that every second house is going to have a gun, because they might be able to take over our military, but then occupying us is a different thing. So that's another reason why long-term John Howard was wrong and the Libertarians are right.
There is, of course, in such a situation, we can't rule out geopolitical shifts in the future, potentially leading to some sort of an invasion. There is, of course, the issue of a post-invasion insurgency. We've seen the effectiveness of that. Afghanistan has illustrated that so clearly in the 1980s against the the Soviet Union. And then since then, of course, with the United States post 9/11, the effectiveness of relatively underpowered weapons, guns, rifles, these sorts of things in the context of a post-occupation insurgency can be very valuable as well. There is, of course, the apocryphal quote, which I'm sure you're mindful of, attributed to Admiral Yamamoto, saying that you cannot invade the mainland of the United States. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass. And it's very unlikely that he ever actually said it in as many words, but it does appear to be an accurate summation of sentiments that he did express. Are you alone in the New South Wales Parliament? Are you alone around Australia? Is there anyone other than Libertarians who are trying to make something like this happen?
Well, there used to be elements in the National Party, but they don't exist anymore. The people who understand these issues. Bob Katter's very good. Now, we do have two members of the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party here in the New South Wales Upper House. And look, these guys are very dedicated, and they're very, they're basically, I think they've taken the view that, there's this sort of, inexorable sort of tsunami coming into a road gun rights, piece by piece, little by little. Okay, now the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party are diligently resisting that. Okay, and they know their way around Parliament. Okay, and good on them. They're doing a good job. But my view is that, look, we needed to not just be on the defensive. We did need to sort of go on the attack and not be mealy mouthed about it and say exactly what we think, which is, it's in the long term interests of Australia that the people do have the right to bear arms.
Well, look, I applaud you. I agree with your objectives here. I certainly do support gun ownership, and I believe that Australians should have the right to keep and bear arms, the same as what the US do. Whether we will see that happen in my lifetime, I'm not sure, but I'm grateful to see people like yourself using the opportunity and really fulfilling the mandate that you've been given by the people of New South Wales, in your case, to go in and fight for their human rights from a libertarian perspective. John Ruddick, MLC, thank you so much for joining me here on the Topher Project.
Good on you, Topher. Thanks so much, mate.
Cheers.